For our protagonist, IT was just an old building in the city center, a structure that had become a skeleton of concrete and glass. This place was once the Grand Belle Epoque, a beacon of luxury and sophistication in a golden age. Today, it is just what remains of a forgotten era, a vertical coffin of faded memories. Urban legends, like the legends of ancient folklore, have always been humanity's way of trying to fill in the gaps of the inexplicable. They come to life in the mouths of those who tell them, transforming and adapting, but the essence remains. The legend of the Grand Belle Epoque is one of them. They say that, at the height of its glory, the hotel had a floor that did not exist. A 13th floor, a number that many hotels avoid. But here the superstition was deeper, more real. It was not a floor that was lost in the architectural plans, but a space that simply manifested itself, accessible by elevator, but only on certain nights and only for those chosen by the legend. Curiosity, the same force that drives us to explore the unknown, is what prompted Daniel, an architectural historian, to take an interest in this place. He wasn't looking for ghosts or hauntings. He was looking for history, the stories of the people who lived and worked there. But like all good stories, that of the Grand Belle Epoque refused to be told in a simple way. The original blueprints of the building seemed to be incomplete, with the floor numbering jumping from the 12th to the 14th. There was no trace of the 13th floor, not even a mention in old documents. But then Daniel found something. A floor plan, a dusty draft, hidden in a file belonging to a former hotel employee. The drawing showed the 13th floor, not as a normal floor, but as a strange space, with rooms that repeated themselves, corridors that twisted around themselves, and a handwritten note. Dimensional flaw? Reality repeats itself here. Those few words planted a seed of doubt in Daniel's mind, a seed that began to germinate in the form of an obsession. The theory that took hold in Daniel's mind was that this floor, this missing space, was not an architectural error, but the result of a distortion, a kind of echo of time and space, an anomaly that manifested itself in the fabric of reality. The search for answers became a nocturnal pilgrimage. Daniel, with the blueprint in hand, began visiting the hotel, breaking into the place on nights he had marked on his calendar, based on astronomical events and reports from witnesses who had somehow gained access to the floor. Legend had it that the flaw was weaker when the stars aligned in a certain way, when the energy of the Earth and the cosmos met at a point of convergence. He needed to be there. He needed to see it with his own eyes. It was no longer about history. It was about the truth behind the legend. The first night yielded nothing. Neither did the second. But on the third, something changed. The air inside the elevator grew heavy. The light flickered for an instant, and the button panel, which previously only showed numbers up to 12 and then 14, now had a 13. The button was there, solid, inviting. Daniel felt a mixture of fear and excitement. It was as if reality, for a brief moment, had adjusted its map, revealing a path that should not exist. And he, a historian seeking the truth, was about to step onto that path, to cross the line between the known and the unknown. The elevator door opened with a creaking sound, revealing a hallway lit by yellow, flickering lights. The smell of mold and dust mixed with a scent of roses and cigars. The walls, the wallpaper, the paintings. Everything seemed to be in perfect condition, as if time had not touched that place. But Daniel knew that the hotel had been abandoned for decades. That was impossible. He was no longer in the hotel he knew. He was in the Grand Belle Epoque, but not the Grand Belle Epoque of today. It was a visual paradox, a place that should have been decrepit, but remained in a state of temporal suspension. The distant murmurs and laughter Daniel heard became clearer as he walked. They were people's voices, echoes of conversations lost in time, but there, in that space, they seemed more alive than ever. He stopped in front of what appeared to be a ballroom door. The door was ajar, and a soft yellow light leaked through the crack. Through the space, he could see the silhouettes of people moving, dancing to the sound of a jazz orchestra. Daniel pushed the door open carefully, and what he saw took his breath away. It was a party. Men in tuxedos and women in long, elegant dresses moved to a calm and harmonious rhythm. The music was perfect, the lighting soft. It was a scene from an old movie. But they weren't people. They were translucent, spectral. They couldn't see him. They were echoes, manifestations of a past reality, living in eternal repetition of their lives. Daniel realized that the theory of a pocket reality was not just a hypothesis. It was the truth. The 13th floor was not a portal to the world of the dead, but a place where time had broken down, a bubble of space-time where the memories and emotions of people who had lived in the hotel had materialized. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but alternate versions of themselves, trapped in a time loop, reliving the most significant moments of their lives. The sound of the music was a recording, an echo of a gala evening. The conversations, fragments of gossip and laughter. He walked among them, invisible, an observer in a world that did not belong to him. He saw a couple dancing, smiles on their faces. He saw a man alone, smoking a cigar and looking out the window, as if waiting for someone. The scenes repeated themselves. The actions were the same. It was like a movie on loop, a narrative that unfolded without an end, without a new beginning. Daniel began to feel a deep sadness. Those people didn't know they were trapped. They didn't know that their lives had become a memory, a performance without an audience, except for him. He left the ballroom and continued exploring the corridors. He saw the manifestation of a waiter, balancing a tray of champagne glasses. In one of the suites, he saw the manifestation of a woman getting ready for dinner, her dress spread out on the bed. Everything was a reflection of a life that had existed, a broken mirror of a past that refused to be forgotten. The theory of dimensional failure became even more concrete in Daniel's mind. The space on the 13th floor was a point of singularity, where matter and memory had merged. But then something different happened. The manifestation of the man with the cigar, whom Daniel had seen in the ballroom, appeared in the hallway, walking toward him. Daniel cowered, fearing that the ghost would see him, that he would recognize him as an anomaly in his routine. But the man, the manifestation of a distant past, stopped. He looked directly at Daniel, with a gaze that seemed to carry infinite sadness. And for the first time, one of the apparitions broke the pattern. The man, the ghost, opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He reached out his hand, as if he wanted to touch Daniel. Fear took hold of Daniel, and he took a step back. The apparition seemed to be trying to communicate. This was not a repetition. It was an interaction. That ghost was somehow aware of his presence. He was an anomaly in their world. The line between observer and observed had dissolved, and Daniel was no longer just a spectator. He had become part of the story. Daniel turned and ran back to the elevator, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. Panic made him press the ground floor button repeatedly, as if rushing could force reality back into place. The ghost of the man with the cigar seemed to chase him, its translucent form moving faster but fading as it approached the elevator. The elevator door slammed shut, and the floor bell rang. Daniel leaned against the wall, panting. The relief was instantaneous, but the certainty that he had to get out of that place was even greater. He pressed the ground floor button again, but the elevator button panel was back to showing only the 12th and 14th floors. The 13th had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Reality had readjusted, the dimensional flaw had closed, and Daniel was trapped. The elevator did not move. The light inside began to flicker erratically, and the smell of mold, which he had forgotten, returned with a vengeance. Panic gave way to icy clarity. He was no longer on a research trip. He was in a trap. The dimensional rift he had sought so long had now imprisoned him. He found himself forced to look for another way out, but there were no stairs on the 13th floor, only a metal door that appeared to be a maintenance closet. He pushed it open and found a narrow, spiral staircase that descended into darkness. The fear of being trapped on a ghost floor was greater than the fear of the darkness, so he began to descend, each step a silent echo on the staircase. As he descended, the atmosphere changed again. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropped, and a smell of salt water of the sea began to seep in. Daniel felt disoriented. It didn't make sense. He was in a hotel in the city center, not on the coast. Reality seemed to be bending again, twisting into something new and frightening. He felt that the dimensional fault was not just a single point, but a series of distortions, a labyrinth of realities. The staircase opened onto a hallway that did not lead to the ground floor, but to a strange space with windows that revealed the darkness of the sea. Daniel was on a ship. Not a real ship, but a ghostly manifestation of a ship. The structure was that of a luxury vessel, with ballrooms and cabins. He could hear the sounds of seagulls and the sound of waves crashing against the hull. The reality of the hotel had mixed with something else, something he couldn't identify. The dimensional flaw, at first, seemed like a portal to a single place, but now he realized it was a two-way street, a crossroads of memories, a place where the line between what is and what was completely blurred. He remembered an old story about the Grand Belle Epoque, one about an accident. A cruise ship, the Queen of the Seas, had sunk off the coast of the city almost a century ago. Many of the passengers were frequent guests at the hotel. Legend had it that the ghosts of the passengers and crew never left the city, trapped between the sea and the land. Daniel realized that the ghost floor was more than a time bubble. It was a convergence of events, an overlap of tragedies and lives. The memories of the hotel and the memories of the ship had merged into a single space, creating an echo of ghosts who now lived in two realities at the same time. And Daniel, the historian, was right in the middle of it. He walked through the ship's halls, observing the ghosts that lived there. They were the same types of manifestations, trapped in a cycle, reliving the last moments of their lives on the ship. He stopped in front of a ballroom, where a masquerade ball was in progress. The ghosts danced, their masks reflecting the ghostly light of the room. Among the dancers, Daniel recognized a face, one he had seen in the hotel corridors. It was the manifestation of the woman who was getting ready for dinner. That was the proof. The two realities were intertwined. He approached, and the woman's manifestation stopped dancing. She turned her head slowly, as if she could sense him there. And like the man with the cigar, she looked at him, and a faint, indecipherable murmur escaped her translucent lips. She wasn't dancing. She was searching for something. Daniel realized that the dimensional flaw was not just a trap, but a kind of prison for these manifestations. They were trapped between two worlds, unable to move on, condemned to relive their tragedies. The man with the cigar, the woman in the dress, they were all trapped, and Daniel's presence, an outsider, was a disturbance. He was a kind of beacon, an anomaly that broke the cycle. The woman's manifestation reached out toward Daniel, and a small guest book, which had been on one of the tables, flew toward him. The book opened to the last page, and Daniel read a handwritten message. "We were taken to the floor that doesn't exist. We are all here." The message was not a code, but a cry for help. Those people, the ghosts, were not just echoes, but souls who were somehow aware of their situation. They had been taken to the dimensional fault, a kind of purgatory where their memories, their lives, and their tragedies became a single entity. The 13th floor was not a portal, but the result of a catastrophic event, a distortion that trapped people at the moment of their death. And the shipwreck, the great event, was the catalyst. The souls of the ship's passengers were drawn to the hotel, a place many of them knew and loved, and were stuck in limbo. Daniel felt overwhelmed. The legend, which seemed so simple, was actually a complex story of tragedy and imprisonment. He was no longer a historian, but a kind of savior. Those souls, those ghosts, didn't want to relive their lives. They wanted to leave. Daniel's presence on the floor had opened a crack, an opportunity. He was the key to their freedom, the only one who could break the cycle. But how? He was still trapped. The door that had brought him there had disappeared, and he was in a maze of memories. The only way out was forward. He picked up the guest book, the last page serving as a map for what he had to do. There was a drawing, a diagram of a series of doors and corridors. It seemed to be a path. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew it was his only chance to get out of there, the only way to help those souls, to give them the peace they so desperately sought, and the only way to save himself. Following the map in the guest book, Daniel moved through a maze that existed only at the intersection of two realities. The path was not linear. It passed through a hotel room with its unmade bed, only to enter the ship's dining room with its empty chairs. The images overlapped, and the jazz music mingled with the sound of the waves, creating a cacophony of memories. The ghosts, the echoes of past lives, now followed him. not with the intention of trapping him, but of guiding him. They were like a choir of lost souls, pointing the way to salvation. The map led him to a ballroom. The passengers and guests were all there, in one last dance. The man with the cigar, the woman in the dress, the waiter with the tray. They did not look at him with fear, but with gratitude. They seemed to know that this was the end, that their journey was about to end. The sound of music and conversation began to fade. The apparitions became more translucent, their forms dissolving into the air, like smoke in the wind. They were not disappearing. They were finally moving on. What followed was absolute silence. The sound of the wind, the sound of the rain, the sound of the city outside. Everything had disappeared. Daniel was alone in an empty hall, with only the light from the elevator coming from the end of the corridor. He felt exhausted but at peace. He hadn't just discovered an urban legend. He had solved it. The dimensional fault theory was the key. The floor was a prison, and by entering and understanding the story, he had somehow broken the spell. He had freed the souls trapped between the hotel and the ship. He walked to the elevator, and the button panel was there again. The 12th, the 14th, and to his surprise, the 13th. But this time, the button for the 13th floor was blank. He pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator moved smoothly, without the noise of before. The door opened to a scene he recognized. The abandoned lobby of the Grand Belle Epoque, with its dust and cobwebs. The smell of mold and abandonment. But now, the place looked different. It was no longer a coffin of memories, but a place of rest. The energy of the place, the sadness he felt when he entered, had disappeared. Daniel stepped out of the elevator and looked at the panel. The 13th floor did not exist. The legend had returned to being just a legend, but with an ending that no one else would ever know. He left the hotel, stepping out into the cold city night. The city looked the same, but Daniel was no longer the same. He had seen what exists between time and space, the fine line that separates reality from fantasy. And he would keep the truth about the forgotten floor, a place he had repaired, a place that could now finally rest in peace.